Chapter 5. The Bends. The longer the men worked in the caissons, the sicker some of them got. They would come up out of the caisson and collapse on the ground in pain. Sometimes they vomited. Sometimes their legs or arms hurt terribly. Sometimes they couldn't see properly. Some men couldn't even walk. They could be paralyzed for a few days. But they never felt any pain when they were down in the caisson, only after they came back up to dry land. The men didn't get sick until a few weeks on the job, so it seemed the sickness was from spending too much time down there. But that was only part of the problem. The men were suffering from what we now call the bends. Deep-sea divers get the bends if they come up to the surface too fast. And the deeper they dive, the more slowly they need to come back up. The same was true for the men in the caissons. At first, the caisson wasn't very deep, so the air pressure wasn't very strong. But as the caisson sank, it took more compressed air to push the water out of the big room. The deeper the caisson went, the more slowly the men should have come up to the surface. They should have stayed in the airlock for at least 20 minutes, so their bodies could adjust to the change in air pressure. But they didn't. Pretty soon, men started quitting the job. Washington Roebling couldn't blame them. He could see they were in bad shape. Then, one night, in December 1870, something awful happened. Men were in the caisson on the night shift. One of the workers held a candle too near the ceiling. The seams between the ceiling planks were sealed with oakum, which is twisted rope coated with black tar that burned easily. Suddenly, the caisson was on fire. The men tried to put out the fire. They threw buckets of water up into the air. They used fire extinguishers. They stuffed wet rags into the hole where the fire was burning. Finally, they brought hoses down into the caisson to pump water at the fire. At first, that seemed to work. But the compressed air inside the caisson made the fire burn super fast. It burned deep into the thick wooden ceiling of the caisson, like a river of fire running through the wood. Washington Roebling came running as soon as he heard the news. He had been down in the caisson all day but had gone home. Now he was going to be down there all night. He wanted to make sure the fire was really out. He had men drill holes into the ceiling. Even though no one could see the fire, Washington knew it was probably still burning somewhere inside the roof. For hours, Washington worked calmly to help put out the fire. When the fire finally seemed to be out, he went back to the surface. But the minute he came up, he collapsed. He couldn't feel his legs. He couldn't walk. He was completely exhausted and weak. It was his first time getting the bends, but it wouldn't be his last. When the Brooklyn caisson reached 45 feet deep, it hit solid rock. Now it was safe to continue building the tall stone tower on top of it. When each tower was done, it would stand 276.5 feet above the water. Of course, there was already a lot of stone below the water, resting on the caisson, which no one could see. 2 months later, a second caisson was launched. This one was for the tower on the New York side of the river. Washington and his wife, Emily, rode on it like a boat. They felt perfectly safe standing on it, waving to people who watched from ashore. Soon, men were working in the New York caisson, digging away. The digging went more quickly this time. The riverbed wasn't so rocky on the New York side. It was just sand. It was easy to dig out the sand and shoot it up through the tubes to the surface. 10 to 14 men in the caisson would stand around a tube, shoveling sand toward it as fast as they could. The tube sucked the sand up into the air. But as soon as the caisson reached 45 feet deep, the workers started to get sick with the bends. And this time, the job was only half done. The New York caisson would need to go twice as deep as the Brooklyn caisson to reach solid rock. It would have to be about 90 feet deep. A few weeks later, Washington Roebling hired a doctor to try to figure out why the men were getting so sick. One man fell to the ground, bleeding from his ears and nose. More than 100 men got the bends. Many of them quit the job. When the caisson reached 71 feet deep, 2 men died from the bends. One of the men had only been on the job for 1 day. He had worked in the caisson only a few hours when he got sick. He went home and dropped dead outside his bedroom. A few days later, a third man started vomiting and was still vomiting a day later. Everyone, including Washington, was terribly upset. The workers went out on strike. They demanded higher pay and got it. The work continued a few weeks longer, but more men were getting the bends. When a third man died, Washington Roebling made a decision. He stopped the digging. He couldn't ask the men to dig any deeper. He didn't want more men to die. But the caisson was still sitting on gravel and sand. Was the caisson's resting place solid enough to hold up the tower? Washington certainly hoped so.